So welcome back again, everybody. This is Ken Smith from Building Financial Resilience. I am here today with Mike Pieciak, the treasurer from the state of Vermont. For anybody in the United States who doesn't know where Vermont is, it's kind of in the top corner over there up in New England. Beautiful foliage in the fall, wonderful winters, great skiing. So Mike, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ken. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm the state treasurer in Vermont. As you said, some of our famous exports have been Ben and Jerry's and Bernie Sanders and all the like. But Vermont is a very community-oriented state that's really focused on issues involving economic equality, financial equity, thinking about climate and its impact on climate and resiliency and reducing our carbon footprint. And so it's a very forward-thinking state, I think, and certainly a great place to live in terms of natural beauty and outdoor recreation and the like. We're very heavily supported by tourism as well, partly because of how naturally beautiful the state is and how easy it is to get outside and enjoy yourself. And we also have really strong agricultural industries as well. We have other industries too, but I mentioned those because climate is putting a real threat to them in Vermont. Our weather is getting warmer, it's getting wetter, and it puts at risk our agriculture, puts at risk maple sugaring, which is very sort of specific to Vermont, and maple syrup is a big export of our state. But it also puts at risk the tourism sector because it's impacting the ski industry and it's impacting fall foliage, the specific temperatures and the specific weather conditions you need for our leaves to turn so beautiful. That is changing. We're not getting as much snow, so it's harder for ski resorts. So these are things that are real challenges for us economically into the future, both as individuals, but also collectively as our state, and why we're putting so much focus on it.
Terrific. And, I think a lot of people think about Vermont and they don't necessarily think about severe weather, maybe a thunderstorm or something like that. But it was, I believe, in July of 2023 that you guys got hit with a ton of rain. And folks, that is downtown Montpelier, Vermont. I believe more than 80% of the businesses were pretty much destroyed in downtown Montpelier, and that's the capital of the state. Can you talk a little bit more about what your top priorities are in terms of climate resilience for Vermont?
Yeah, for sure. And Ken, you're right. I mean, we knew for a long time that we were going to, like I said, get warmer in Vermont, both in the winter and also in the summer, and that it was going to be wetter, that we were going to see more sustained rain, and then also more severe rain as well that would come down in sort of fast quantities. And in July of 2023, we saw both of those. We saw much of June had sort of consistent rain, not these huge downpours, but it was enough to really have the ground pretty saturated and the rivers pretty high. And then we had a severe rainstorm that came through and caused the flooding that you're seeing here. And that's really unusual for Vermont and for Montpelier, or I should say it used to be very unusual. The other examples that we can point to in our recent past around times when downtown Montpelier had significant flood issues was after Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. Montpelier, if I remember correctly, was barely impacted relative to this storm, but that was a hurricane that became a tropical storm, and it sat over Vermont and it did a ton of damage elsewhere. But that was a tropical storm, hurricane type storm. In 1992, there was really bad flooding in downtown Montpelier that was caused by an ice jam. So ice got dislodged and got stuck under the bridge and backed up the river, and that caused a lot of flooding. So that was a very specific incident that we've been able to mitigate and solve for. And then 1927, there was a significant hurricane that came through Vermont and caused a lot of damage. So I guess my point on that is that there were hurricanes, really super storms that you might expect, really severe weather. there was this one unique incident with the ice and it getting trapped under the bridge and causing flooding in downtown Montpelier. But this storm this past summer was basically just a rainstorm that followed a number of days of rain. And that is something that is unfortunately very repeatable and something that we expect to see a lot more often in Vermont. So we have these mountains and valleys, and that rain really, those mountains just sort of act as a collector, shoot that water down to these streams, and then those streams really, have so much power and have so much water that they jump their banks, and particularly here in Montpelier, where the North Branch came together with the Winooski River, that sort of convalescence of rivers is what caused the flooding here in Montpelier. So it's something that we unfortunately expect to see a lot more of, and that's why we're focused on recovery. We're focused on resiliency, and obviously focused on trying to also build for the futures that we can fund those things as well. But you say here, in terms of the repair and recovery, infrastructure is a big one, because we have old infrastructure in Vermont. We have old wastewater plants. We have bridges that are susceptible to flooding. So some of our work is trying to improve that infrastructure so it's more resilient to the changing climate we're experiencing in Vermont. We had 3 wastewater facilities that were taken out in July that now are facing tens of millions of dollars for repair and moving them to a place that's more resilient. So that's just an example of communities that are really badly hit by this and needing to invest a lot in their infrastructure. I should mention that storm that we had in 2011, we did do a lot of resiliency work following that storm. And as it relates to infrastructure, we expanded culverts, we raised bridges and built them back at a more elevated level. We started to waterproof some buildings in Montpelier. There was a building that we built in Montpelier that couldn't be closer to the river. It was a brand new building, but it was a raised up building where the parking lot was sort of on the first floor. And my point in all of that is that we had much fewer bridge impacts this past July across the state in terms of losing bridges. We had much fewer culverts that were lost because they had more space for water to go through. The places that were impacted last time weren't impacted this time, not because they didn't have the rain, but because we built back in a more secure way. Mm-hmm. So there is some hope in all of this, but it is going to take a lot of investment in infrastructure. And same thing with homes, with small businesses. Small businesses, they lost their inventory, they lost their physical structure. A lot of them didn't have flood insurance. Some of them didn't have enough insurance to cover the business interruption. So they're really hurting, both from like losing all of those assets and that inventory, but they're also hurting because their businesses were shut down for weeks upon weeks upon weeks.
Right.
And even when it came back, they had a lot fewer people walking the streets and a lot fewer tourism coming to Montpelier. So they're really badly hit. And same thing with homes. Homes, we lost a significant portion of the housing stock around the Montpelier area. And a lot of those homes are in floodplains and areas that are prone to flooding. So thinking about how to, waterproof those homes and or moving people and homes to places that are more resilient up in elevation.
Managed retreat. I don't know if you saw, there was a recent article in Salisbury Beach, Massachusetts. The homeowners got together, spent their own money, $500,000. They got, I believe, 140,000 cubic yards of sand, put it down on the beach, and in 3 days it got washed away.
Wow.
And they're right back to where they are. And the homeowners are saying, what are we going to do? The answer is, unfortunately, for something like that, managed retreat. You don't have an option. So, and then when you talk about resilience, I mean, I got to tell you, I love this picture. As you know, I had a place up in New Hampshire right next door, spent a lot of time skiing up in Vermont. It is a wonderful community spirit. I mean, I don't need to tell you, within hours of that flood water finally receding, everybody got out and they prioritized the big roads so that the fire trucks and the ambulances can come. I mean, it was an amazing community response. But tell us a little bit more about some of the new building codes and future preparations. I mean, you kind of already talked about this. What are you doing to make sure that the next storm isn't as bad?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, the community spirit in Vermont has been great. We saw that during the COVID-19 crisis as well. Vermont had one, in my opinion, one of the best responses with some of the lowest case counts, some of the lowest hospitalizations, some of the lowest fatality rates, because we followed the requirements and followed the suggestions and followed the science and the data to sort of band together to protect each other. That was sort of the idea, was we're doing all these sacrifices to protect each other. And here, a very similar story. Neighbors were in need, so Vermonters came out to help, and that has always been the case. That happened after the 2011 Superstorm Sandy as well, or Irene for us. It was Irene that did that. So new building codes, building in ways that are more resilient, trying to have new buildings be put in higher elevations and away from floodplains, buildings that exist in those floodplains and flood zones, trying to reinforce them so their basements are less prone to flooding in the future. Also thinking about natural solutions throughout central Vermont as well. How do we have more wetlands and intentional floodplains so that water has somewhere to go? Yep. It's not racing down the river. That's more of a broad sort of community approach, but that's really important. In terms of community preparedness, that's part of a resiliency strategy that we're working with the governor's office on, trying to think about how to both push out information in a more targeted way, but then also how do we collect information as well from local communities that are on the ground, so that we know, in fact, the water, that a certain community doesn't have water, or a certain community is not connected to the highway and they're not able to get fire or ambulance or whatnot. And, as there always is after a disaster, there was some, miscommunication from the state and local communities. And part of our preparedness is thinking about ways to prevent that or minimize it as much as we can into the future. So I think that's going to be a critical part of our response. And then, the future severe weather predictions, I mentioned that, but when when I was the insurance commissioner before being treasurer of Vermont, we did an analysis of our insurance claims over the last decade, and then projected out 30 years to say, what will our changing climate do to our insurance market? And, what traditionally we had in Vermont were a lot of concerns and a lot of claims during the winter that, there'd be heavy snowfall and that would pack up on somebody's roof and the roof would cave in, or a tree would fall over on somebody's car and somebody's roof because there was a lot of snow on the tree, or people would be running their fireplaces in the winter. So they're more prone to have house fires. Cars, and the travel is much worse with ice, so there's more car accidents. But as the weather is changing and we're seeing less snow, we're having less of those issues. We're having less pipes burst because the weather isn't quite as cold. We're having people needing to have less fires in their fireplace because it's not quite as cold. So some of those claims are expected to change over time. But we are seeing some of our most significant events in the last 10 years was a windstorm in the fall and a hailstorm in the spring. So it is connected to that more severe weather. And it's something that's changing here in New England and certainly changing in other parts of the country. But generally, we're expecting to see warmer weather and wetter weather with mixed into that more severe wind and hailstorms as well.
And, I see these pictures. The community response is fantastic. But as I look at the two pictures on the right, and you alluded to it earlier, this is not going to come at a low cost. There is a lot of money that needs to get spent. And so what I'd really love to dive deep on here is this Superfund that I know you're leading. If you could talk a little bit about, we know where the driving force behind it is. What's the status of this fund? Are other states joining? Are they able to join? Tell us a little bit more. This was started. When did you announce this? I believe it was October.
Yeah, last fall. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about this Superfund.
Yeah, so the Superfund really comes out of the point you made, Ken, which is how are you going to pay for all of this, and how are you going to finance it? And we had just finished up a report in our office looking at climate financing, and really what another sort of work stream that we have in Vermont is making sure we don't lose out on money under the IRA for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the resiliency monies that might be available under the IRA. But we really came to the conclusion that the IRA was focused on greenhouse gas reduction largely. There's a lot of money available for that for states and municipalities in the private sector and nonprofit sector. But when it came to resiliency, there was less federal funds sort of available under the IRA. And then B, we're really not talking about financing as much as we're talking about needing to just have funding, needing to have actual just money that we are building things with, because there's not necessarily a revenue stream that's generated by resiliency work. There can be a revenue stream created when you're reducing the cost of something, like with weatherization or electrification. There can be revenue streams when you're talking about green energy production. But when it's really like trying to expand a wetland or trying to reinforce a dam or modernize a dam or trying to waterproof or floodproof a building, you're generally talking about needing money to do those things. And that's where this idea of the Climate Superfund really spur out of, at least in my mind, and why I was so interested in supporting it. And the idea here is that many fossil fuel companies, in extracting and processing and then selling their product across the globe, have reaped tremendous amount of profit in doing this over the last few decades. But what was not built in to their business operations were the negative effects that their product would have on millions and millions and millions of people across the country. So the Climate Superfund Fund is trying to acknowledge that this has been a very profitable business over decades. But by being a very profitable business, they really were excluding some of the costs of doing business within their industry. These are the costs of their industry doing business. And if we have to pay those costs, then that seems unfair. And the question really comes down to, if the big oil, the fossil fuel companies have created this mess, have created this situation where we are having to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build against this changing climate, should Vermonters pay for that? Should taxpayers pay for that? Or should the businesses that caused this in the first place pay for that, and pay for that out of their significant profits that they've made over the last few decades? So that's sort of the rationale and the reason for it. Vermont is moving forward. We actually just this morning voted the bill out of our Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously, 5-0. So that was a bipartisan vote. It'll now go to the Senate Appropriations Committee and then go over to the House. So we are, hopeful that it will move forward this year. There's work for us to do in the Treasurer's Office. There's work for the Agency of Natural Resources to do to try to determine the specific cost that climate change is having on our state, and then also to attribute those costs to specific companies that have a connection to our state as well. So Vermont will be leading the way here. There's other states that have considered this: New York, Massachusetts, Maryland. They're in various, states in their, they're in various points in their legislative process. But if Vermont passes this bill this year, we would be the first. And I think the way to think of it is that we would all have our separate climate superfund. So it wouldn't, we're all doing this sort of in unison or in sort of collaboration with each other, but each state would have their own specific costs and their own specific impacts from climate, and they would have to determine what those are for themselves. There has been talk about this at the national level, but unfortunately that did not go forward during the Build Back Better conversation. But that's left it to the states to lead on this space.
So it'll be a state by state. Just curious, give me a ballpark. Just take the damage in Montpelier from July. What's going to be the total cost to repair? How many hundreds of millions are you talking about?
Well, there's that one facility in Johnson, Vermont that serves 2,000 people that now needs $27 million to repair the wastewater facility, right? Yeah. So you have such a small number of people that has this critical infrastructure. Montpelier, estimates for over $100 million. But that, and that's only just scraping the surface. What does it mean to, so there are these direct damages that are the result, right? Direct infrastructural damages that cities and states have to pay for. Their direct impacts to businesses and to individuals in their homes. But what does it mean for a ski area that all of a sudden in 10 years in southern Vermont only has 30 days that they can be open instead of 95 days that they can be open?
Yeah.
What does that mean for a farm that, used to be able to operate in southern Vermont and now, they only have crops every other year instead of multiple crops per season. So I think you have to figure out what's the most reasonable way to calculate the damages, but the damages can be quite significant when you start to think about all the ways it's impacting us.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I applaud this effort. I think you guys are absolutely bang on. It will probably have to go state by state because every state's going to have slightly different situations. But one thing that we talk about here on this podcast is while all of these efforts are going on and we applaud you and we support you and do what we can, it's imperative that individuals also be resilient. This was a Chubb report that was done in 2023. 76% of their customers felt that exposure to extreme weather caused by climate change is the number one risk to their home. And so, we make three very simple recommendations. Number one, create or update a 5 to 10 year financial plan and assume that you are going to get hit with at least one, perhaps two, severe weather events where your home is going to be severely impacted. We're talking 5 to 6 figures of impact on your home. Second, and you talked about insurance. A lot of the businesses down in Montpelier did not have flood insurance. Our second recommendation, call your insurance agent. There are multiple other types of insurance that you might not have, and even if it doesn't help you fix your home, you might be able to get coverage in another area. For example, art insurance. And it doesn't mean you have a Monet or a Picasso on the wall. You can have a $1,000 picture that somebody gave you for your wedding. You can insure that $1,000 painting. So if it's damaged, you can potentially get a recovery on that. Umbrella insurance is another one. Again, call your insurance agent and see what you can do to absolutely maximize your insurance. And then number three, and you saw the pictures earlier, we really recommend that you invest time and money in event cost mitigation. If you live in a fire-prone area, make sure that you clear away brush from around your house. If you live in a flood zone or you live in an area like Montpelier where you have the potential of a lot of rainwater coming very, very quickly, make sure your gutters keep getting cleaned out. Make sure your runoff is clear. Make sure you assume that you're going to have a heck of a lot more rain than you do. But definitely invest the time and money in doing those activities. And if anybody would like to learn more, this is our book online, Building Financial Resilience for an Uninsurable Future. And for anybody who happened to read, our subtitle is The Impact of Climate Change on Personal Finances and the Wealth of the Nation. Chairman Powell was just in front of the Senate, and one of the comments that he made was that he believes that one of the reasons that inflation remains high is because of insurance premiums and the cost to repair damage from climate change. So it is already beginning to impact the wealth of the nation. And with that, Mike, I want to say thank you again for all of your time. I know how busy you are. I will let you get back to work. So thank you again, and we'll post this up soon.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.